Our beautiful Norfolk coastline is an attraction for many reasons. The glorious beaches, the stunning scenery, a walk along the cliffs or through the sand dunes, the fresh air that fills our lungs. And what we can see here actually is where the end of Wellington Pier, which I'm sure you as a young lad jumped off on numerous occasions, is no more.
It was a working pier with ships bringing cargo and passengers and leaving. It was only later that it became the pleasure pier that most seaside piers became in any case.
For many of us, the piers that have stretched out into the North Sea have held a fascination since childhood. A chance to view the town centre from across the water, go crabbing off the end, visit the entertainment centre or theatre.
100 years it's been going on the end of that pier there's been entertainment, and I'm sort of the last in a long line, and there'll be loads and loads of people for another 100 years that follow what I do. That's a fantastic thing, it really is very special.
But who built them and why? When was the pinnacle of their success? And what purpose do they serve today? Join me, Chris Bailey, as I travel to Hunstanton, Cromer, Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft and take a stroll along the pier. Hunstanton, or sunny Hunny as many locals know it, stands on our county's northwest coast, just 15 miles or so from King's Lynn, and is known for a couple of natural features. The cliffs are unique in Norfolk, made up of 3 layers of rock known as white chalk, hard red clunch and iron brown carstone. They represent some of the sturdiest geology in the county. It's also known as the only resort on the east coast to face west, with the result that many visitors are taken aback to see the sun apparently set over the sea rather than the land. But just 170 years ago, this was a deserted part of Norfolk's coastline. There were a few houses up the coast at Old Hunstanton as we know it now. There was the lighthouse, the ruins of St Edmund's Chapel built in 1272, but little else. One man had a vision to create a new resort, and in 1843 building sites were advertised for the sea bathing station of St Edmund's in Hunstanton. That man was Henry Starman Lestrange, Lord of the Manor and principal landowner from Hunstanton Hall, and with the assistance of his architect friend William Butterfield, began development of his dream. The first building to open in 1847 was the New Inn, still here today as the Golden Lion Hotel, and it was literally built in the middle of nowhere. It was the only building between Heacham and the St Edmund's Chapel ruins, except for 2 small cottages occupied by the builders. It was a slow start for the resort, and by 1861 there was 1 hotel and 5 small houses listed. But just 1 year later, in 1862, the Hunstanton to King's Lynn line opened at a cost of £80,000. This part of northwest Norfolk was now accessible. Where once the summertime boats would bring day trippers from King's Lynn to Hunstanton, now the railway line could transport so many more via land. Its popularity was boosted when Queen Victoria purchased nearby Sandringham House in that year for her son Edward, Prince of Wales. Now everyone wanted to visit the Norfolk coastline. At its height, this station had 2 long island platforms which could take excursion trains with up to 1,000 people on board. And its seafront location meant that passengers were discharged directly onto the promenade. Long-stay holidaymakers would arrive on a Saturday, day trippers on a Sunday, in a constant stream of trains at 10-minute intervals. And now the station site is this massive car park, and all that's left is this coal merchant's shed and this 10-foot of line that just remains here. Sadly, the man with the vision, Henry Lestrange, never saw the first train arrive in Hunstanton. He died aged 47, just a few months before the station opened in October 1862. Henry's son, Hammond Lestrange, carried on his father's legacy and vision, supervising the development which now grew rapidly with the increase of hotels and guest houses springing up in the village. And in keeping with the best holiday resorts of the time, such as Southend, Brighton and Bournemouth, a pier was constructed by a company of local investors with a capital of £2,000. Local historian and author John Maiden has lived all his life in Hunstanton and has extensively researched the life of the pier. So John, how long has the Heritage Centre been open?
2013. We had an official opening by the 12th Earl of Portland.
Oh, okay.
Well, better known to many people as David Archer from the Archers, Tim Bentinck. Henry's vision didn't include a pier. It was interesting. It was just a wide sweep of open grassland leading down to what was then a cliff. And it was Henry's son, Hammond, who must have given permission for the Hunstanton Pier Company to build this pier. Work started in 1868, and the Hunstanton Pier Company was actually created by a local Act of Parliament. And the work went ahead, obviously, with the blessing of Hammond Lestrange, and he made sure that he had free passes to use the pier. The rent for the pier was only £1 a year, but of course, for that concession, the pier had to be kept in good order. They had to be maintained properly. There was some controversy of the two little buildings on either side of the entrance because they were actually on the green, which in those days was supposed to be sacrosanct with no buildings on it at all, an open space. But that permission was granted for that, and it opened with great ceremony. Officially opened in 1870, and it was a working pier with ships bringing cargo and passengers and leaving, and it was only later that it became the pleasure pier that most seaside piers became in any case. At the turn of the century, about 1904, we think, the Pavilion Theatre opened. It was very much on the same lines as the theatre on the end of Cromer Pier. And the actual shows and things they put on were typical seaside shows with pierrots and all the rest of it.
A stroll along the pier was part of the walking way of life in the pre-motorcar days. Ladies dressed up for it even though their large hats had to be tied down against the wind. On one's leisurely way up to the seaward end, the small gaps in the wooden planking would reveal the water below and make it slightly unnerving for young children. And there was quite a selection of white-painted kiosks for tea, ices and sweets built around the pavilion at the end. Deck chairs could be hired out, and it was always possible to sit out of the breeze on one side or other. The view to Landward End made a delightful prospect, and at bank holiday times, the beach would be thick with people who had come as far afield as London on the many excursion trains. And once you'd walked the pier, then there was always the promenade to discover.
At the time the pier was built, there was no promenade, and it was a chap called John W. Beaton who started proposing that there should be a promenade, and he built on it the North Promenade. There was no South Promenade, and it wasn't until 1932, when the boating lake was built, that the promenade was extended southwards. Before that, there was a fairground, but it was on the beach. It wasn't even protected by a promenade. Yeah. But the boating lake was seen as a big advantage because it had the promenade on the seaward side. The nice thing about the boating lake was it had a variety of boats, everything from kayaks, Indian canoes, to quite large rowing boats. And the only motorised craft was a big motorboat for the elderly, which Hunstanton's always had its fair share, to be driven around serenely while the other people were floundering around in their rowing boats and canoes. But it was a great place, it always was. In 1935, I read that to celebrate the Silver Jubilee of George V, they had races for a regatta. In 1928, the swimming pool opened, and it was opened by a very famous person, Mercedes Gleitzer, an Englishwoman, in spite of her Swiss-German surname. She had swum the channel, and for a while I thought she was the first woman to swim the channel, but it turned out she was the first English woman to swim the channel. But a couple of American ladies had beaten her to it. So she came to Hunstanton in 1928 to open the swimming pool, and she returned the following year by sea, and she left the Lincolnshire coast to swim the Wash. And of course, because of the tides and currents, she didn't actually arrive where she should have done at the end of the pier. She arrived on Heacham Beach, where they immediately put a memorial to say that she'd landed there. She was then transported by road to come to the pier, where a reception was held for her. The swimming pool began in great style, crowds of people again, just as 4 years later they were for the boating lake. It was wonderful. It was a combination of a leisure pool and a proper swimming pool, and the way that the swimmers were separated from the non-swimmers was from side to side. We had a shallow side and a deep side, which enabled swimmers to swim lengths without bumping into people wandering about. And at the same time, there was an enormous stretch of water where people could learn to swim in what probably started about 2 foot of water, gradually getting deeper. So it was fantastic. One end, of course, there was a diving basin, because we had diving boards, which sadly we don't have anymore. It's only 8'6" of water, but you can still dive carefully into it from 5 metres.
In part 2, we discover how the theatre suffered irreparable damage from fire in 1939, the miniature railway that ran the full length, and I meet one man who recalls performing acrobatic figure skating routines on the rink at the end of the pier. The very make-up and location of a pier means that it is susceptible to nature, and all along our coastline the ravages of storms and swelling seas can be seen. Piers suffered constantly from the dangerous gales, and yet it was fire that destroyed the pier end in June 1939. These were wooden structures, as were the pavilions, so it's not surprising that the flames that engulfed the theatre on that June day wreaked mayhem on the building. People ran to shore in an effort to avoid any casualty, yet 2 women got trapped. They had somehow not escaped with the others, and in pictures taken by a resourceful photographer, we can see the dilemma they had. They hung onto the rails, literally between the devil and the deep, and were unable to be reached by the rescue parties. The tide was up, so at the last moment they had to jump or fry, and were picked up and saved. The photographer rushed the images to the London newspapers, and the story hit the headlines. That was 1939, and 2 months later Britain was at war with Nazi Germany. All building works were halted as the nation fought the enemy, and the pavilion was never rebuilt. In those days after the war, the pier was owned by Horace Brooke, and it was his son Peter who had the bright idea to have a roller skating rink at the pier head. On the rink, there were occasional acrobatic skating figure routines displayed by couples such as Stanley Balls and Leslie Elson.
First pair of skates cost me 8 shillings and 9pence. I used to skate on the road outside the house, you know. Steel wheels they were then, and strap-on skates. Go up and down the road you could, and perhaps you'd have to stop for a herd of sheep to come by. Never hardly saw a car, you know.
So, Stan, what are your memories of performing at the end of the pier?
It used to be a bit windy up there. You'd be perhaps a bit cool some days, and you'd really get a bit drafty, you know. But later on in time, as we went on, because I was up there a few years, they put a glass screen up, which made it so much better. I used to think it was great, really. As I couldn't swim, I used to think it's lovely to be above the water instead of going underneath it. And I hope the pier doesn't collapse. That was the thing I used to think of.
I remember it had big cracks, and every time you went over a crack with your wheels, it made a sort of da-dung noise. The pier was also so much very, very central to our playing. I can remember my mum, both of our mothers and fathers saying, if you're going to go out, whichever way you go, whether you go the Cliffs Way or the South Way, don't go out the side of the pier. So that was your boundaries. If you could see the pier, you were allowed to be there.
Did they have kiosks and food outlets and ice creams there at the end?
At the head of the pier they did, but on the way, walking the length of the pier, there was only the train and seats all the way along, and people should sit there and just look at the sea and look at the land. It was lovely. I really do actually still do miss it.
There was a choice of transport on the pier in the 1950s. You could use your legs and walk the 830 feet, or take the miniature railway operated by John W. Harris. Powered by a Bassett Loke engine, it ran the length of the pier and was a popular attraction for children of all ages.
The railway was another big hit. I wouldn't say it was as big a loss as losing the actual railway, but the railway itself was very popular with a little miniature steam locomotive. And either Sid, the pier master, would be driving it, or later the owner of the pier became John W. Harris, and he would quite like to drive his train. The family just loved it.
Particularly as a small boy, it was always a treat when we had relatives come to stay in Hunstanton. They would ask you, what would you like to do? And one of the favourites was, let's go and have a ride on the train to the end of the pier and back.
But towards the end of the 1950s, it was dismantled and the seaward end fell into disuse. At the shoreward end, a two-storey amusement building replaced an old arcade and cafe and opened in 1964.
Although the pier should have been kept in tip-top condition, the maintenance, that part of the condition in the lease that the pier had to be maintained, was rather not taken seriously. And so there was a time when there was very little at the end of the pier. I think there was a reluctance. They knew that the stability of the pier wasn't that great. Although the pier head itself had been made more secure, because after the war, Horace Brooke, he had to replace the decking where the pavilion fire had occurred, and he looked down these hollow iron tubes and poured concrete down. And so that made that more stable, but the stretch of 800 foot from the shore to the end of the pier was a little bit suspect.
Given that there's now nothing to see out to sea here at Hunstanton, you will have guessed that the wonderful pier finally succumbed to the great British weather that sweeps through this part of the Norfolk coast. It was the 11th of January 1978. There were great storms throughout the south and the southeast of the UK. And that storm sadly destroyed Hunstanton's 110-year-old pier. Over a century had passed since its opening, and the decades of entertainment, promenading, roller skating, miniature railway journeys and ice creams were now washed away. Decades of being part of life of the seaside, for piers were in all the self-respecting resorts around the coast of England. The storm left the pier end in place, but that too was removed by the council some weeks later, leaving just the amusement arcade and a few stumps in the sand.
My memories of the 78 storm, one of sadness, because something I'd grown up with was no longer there. But at the same time, that storm, although it didn't cause any loss of life, also created havoc amongst all the static caravan sites to the south of the town where the 1953 floods had occurred. And so I think probably the feeling was that by some people that it had its day.
Of course, by now the railway station had closed, the trains no longer bringing hundreds of eager weekly or day trippers to discover sunny Hunny. The package holiday to Europe had seen to the decline of towns like Hunstanton as holiday destinations. And even though the wonderful Princess Theatre in its many guises as cinema, bingo hall and theatre offered shows to entertain, there is nothing quite like a pier to attract an audience. In 2002, the entire amusement arcade as well as the remnants of the pier were destroyed in a fire. As the building was so badly damaged, firemen could not determine the cause of that fire.
I've been out of town for the day, and when I came home I was informed that the pier buildings, which I didn't ever like, had burnt down. As I went and was taking photographs to mark the end of an era. But at the same time, I personally wrote a letter to the newspaper saying, this is Golden Jubilee year. Why don't we reinstate the pier as part of the Golden and have a proper pier? And a lot of support was generated for that. It didn't take, unfortunately, and that's why we've got the building we've got there now.
Today, a new arcade and bowling alley complex occupies the site, but although the building is referred to locally as the pier, there is virtually nothing left that could be described as a pier in any real sense.
It's very clear from talking to a lot of people there's still a great deal of affection for Hunstanton Pier. Perhaps not the last 15 years or so until its demise in 1978, but for the days when the pier was a pier and it was part of everyday life at the seaside.
Days when the trains ran, the hotels were full and the boarding houses flourished. The local newspapers printed columns of names in their visitors' lists for each establishment, and the Pierrots entertained. Here in Hunstanton, the Great Eastern Railway maintained a 5-star hotel called the Sandringham beside the station, to accommodate all those people who came to visit every weekend in the season.
Henry Lestrange's vision in the middle of the 19th century was for a sea bathing resort only. It was to entertain the visitors. It incorporated his new inn, or Golden Lion Hotel as it is today, but it never had a pier in the original plans. And yet the pier that came along just a few years after his death was part of the grand attraction that brought hundreds and thousands of people to this part of northwest Norfolk, by train and by road. And whilst its wooden structure is no longer with us, it's very clear that it lives long in the memory of many people.
It sits on the most easterly point of the United Kingdom, looking directly across to our European neighbours, and is a town that has developed from the rich pickings of the sea. Lowestoft can boast 2 piers: South Pier, built as the outer harbour grew in the mid-19th century, and Claremont Pier, opened in 1903 to accommodate the day trippers on the Bell steamers visiting from London and all points between. Join me next week as I discover the varying fortunes of these 2 structures.